What's up, Fortune fam? Welcome back, and thank you for joining us for our final episode of The Making of America, a three-part series where we take a closer look at the development of America's economic history. I'm Sadie's with the Fortune Society, and you're tapped into the Fortune Chat. In this last episode, we'll discuss the financial impact discrimination had on economic markets that are critical to wealth accumulation, like real estate, financing, commerce, employment, and investments. To truly understand the historical cost of discrimination, we have to look back in time to the present. As we enter the 1900s, we'll begin to see the economy shift from agricultural to industrial manufacturing to corporate. Slaves are free, all blacks are now given citizenship, and black men have the right to vote. Women, black or white, didn't have that same right, but that's a different conversation for another day. Some blacks progressed and openly furthered their education, profession, and wealth, while others were displaced, uneducated, and remained in severe poverty. In 1910, blacks began to migrate in large numbers from the South to the North. In 1915 and 1916, natural disasters in the South put many agricultural workers and sharecroppers out of a job. Additionally, World War I caused immigration to the United States to fall, forcing northern recruiters to head south to recruit black workers to their companies. By 1920, over 300,000 black Americans from the South had moved north. Blacks began opening businesses, establishing towns with entertainment, schools, restaurants, medical, dental, and law offices, and they even had photography studios. Now, even though blacks had freedom and rights, they still faced harassment, racial discrimination, inequality, lynchings, and the possibility of having their peaceful towns raided by radical white mobs, like the Tulsa Massacre in 1921. This unfortunate situation left up to 10,000 educated black Americans displaced without anything. In October of 1929, the stock market crashed and America entered the Great Depression. Millions of people, both black and white, were out of work. Unemployment skyrocketed, but blacks were particularly hit the hardest. In 1933, the government introduced the New Deal, a series of programs, public service projects, financial reforms, and regulations enacted by President Roosevelt. A few of these programs included the FSA, Farm Security Administration, the AAA, Agricultural Adjustment Administration, the NRA, National Recovery Administration, the SSB, Social Security Board, the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and the FERA, Federal Emergency Relief Administration. It wasn't until the Second World War that the economy began to turn around. All of these federal policies and programs were introduced, but they were left to local administrators to run. And you know what that means. You got it. Discrimination. Everyone was supposed to get a cut of this New Deal, but localized racial practices don't just disappear overnight. On one hand, you have the FSA saving American farms, but the ones that were being saved were white-owned, not black-owned. The NRA created wage standards across the country, but failed to establish a minimum wage for people in agriculture or domestic work, the jobs blacks were mostly employed in. In 1933, the federal government was faced with a housing shortage. Why was there a shortage? Well, during this time, the unemployment had reached 25%, and thousands of banks and loan companies were failing. On top of that, annual mortgage lending and new residential construction had fallen by 80%. In 1934, the government launched programs that were intentionally designed to increase housing for white Americans and disenfranchised blacks. Ever hear the word redlining? Well, it starts here. In 1934, the Federal Housing Administration was established. Efforts through the FHA were to increase home ownership amongst white families, making housing and mortgages more accessible and affordable. Now, that's great, but black families and others of color were completely left out of the deal. According to NPR.org's A Forgotten History of How the U.S. Government Segregated America, the FHA refused to insure mortgages in or near African American neighborhoods. At the same time, the FHA was subsidizing builders who were mass-producing entire subdivisions for whites, with the requirement that none of the homes be sold to African Americans. The term redlining comes from the development of the New Deal. The federal government created maps of every metropolitan area in the country, and those maps were color-coded by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. The FHA followed suit, as did the Veterans Administration. These color codes were designed to indicate where it was safe to insure mortgages. Anywhere African Americans lived or lived nearby, were colored red to indicate to appraisers that these neighborhoods were too risky to insure mortgages. The FHA manual explicitly laid out segregationist policies. It was something called the Underwriting Manual of the Federal Housing Administration, and it said that incompatible racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities, meaning that loans to African Americans could not be insured. Today, Black American incomes on average are about 60% of white American incomes, yet Black wealth is about 5% of white wealth. Most middle-class families in this country gain their wealth from equity they have in their homes. So the enormous difference between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is almost entirely attributable to the federal housing policies implemented throughout the 20th century. Black Americans were not only being kept out of the real estate market, they were also being deprived of fair employment opportunities. In 1935, the Social Security Act was established. It introduced benefits for old age workers, benefits for victims of industrial accidents, the blind and handicapped, unemployment insurance, and aid for dependent mothers and children, better known as welfare. It excluded about half the workers in the American economy from coverage. Among the excluded groups were agricultural and domestic workers, a large percentage of whom were Black Americans. Employers worried that federal benefits would discourage Black workers from taking low-paying jobs in their fields, factories, and kitchens, thus ensuring neither agricultural laborers nor domestic servants were covered by Social Security insurance. This group accounted for at least 60% of the nation's Black population. Black labor movements and organizations began coming together to fight for economic resources. During this time, Blacks were discriminated against and kept out of unions, so organizations had to fight to get them in. Organizations like the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, founded in 1925 and led by A. Philip Randolph and Milton P. Webster, aimed to improve the working conditions and treatment of Black American railroad porters and maids employed by the Pullman Company, a manufacturer and operator of railroad cars. After a lot of stalling, the Pullman Company agreed to begin negotiating in good faith with the porters, and on April 25, 1937, signed the first agreement between a union of Black American workers and a major American corporation. The contract between the Pullman Company and the BSCP brought the porters the single largest wage increase they had ever received under an agreement with Pullman. The Pullman Company became a great vehicle for a segment of Black American families to obtain middle-class status. Jobs with the Pullman porters, the U.S. Postal Service, and the military were three great ways for many Black Americans to transition to middle-class status. The best-paying jobs in the country at the time were factory work, a position that Blacks were excluded from. It was okay for them to push a broom in the factory, but they weren't allowed to work the machines. Black organizations called for access to all jobs and anti-discrimination policies. During World War II, white men were pulled from the factories and sent to fight, and white women replaced them in those jobs. This was certainly a radical change for women, but Black men and women were not extended those opportunities. In 1941, A. Philip Randolph proposed a march on Washington, demanding something be done regarding Blacks' access to employment. That same year, President Roosevelt signed the executive order forming the Fair Employment Practices Committee. There shall be no discrimination in the employment of workers in the defense industries or government because of race, creed, color, or national origin. At the end of the war, Black soldiers who returned home still faced discrimination. They didn't receive fair or equal employment, credit, nor housing opportunities. They fought for democracy overseas, but were treated like second-class citizens in their own country. In addition to racial discrimination and violence, Black soldiers were often denied benefits guaranteed under the GI Bill, the legislation that provided tuition assistance, job placement, and home and business loans to veterans. Civil rights and labor organizations began to band together, calling for civil rights, fair wages, the ban of discrimination in employment, equal education, and opportunities. Blacks didn't just seek freedom, they sought opportunities, equality, the right to fair life, labor, and resources. White workers earned 2 times more than Black workers. White Americans born between 1943 through 1951 would go on to accumulate 11 times more wealth than Black Americans born within that period, with the median family income from 1950 to 1965 continuing to increase for white men. Despite the inequality and huge wage gap, miraculously, Blacks still made a living for themselves, providing for their families, sending their children to college, and buying homes. Unfortunately, under private real estate contracts with extreme hidden markups and interest. In 1968, the government introduced the Fair Housing Act, which was designed to outlaw housing discrimination based on race, color, religion, and national origin. From 1950 to 1970, despite housing discrimination in the U.S. being legal for most of that time, American blacks were able to increase their home ownership rate from 35% in 1950 to 42% in 1970, almost a 20% increase in ownership. But for black families, that strive for home ownership and generational wealth building was sabotaged somewhere around the 1980s into the present day. Fast forward to 2020, only 44% black families own their homes, compared to 73% of white families, according to the Census Bureau. That is a 2% increase in 50 years. I don't know about you guys, but something smells fishy to me. The black community is missing millions of acres of land, millions of jobs, and millions of black businesses, economic factors critical to wealth accumulation. Real estate, employment, and business opportunities are super important. Slavery, which was the foundation of the American economy, was a 100% tax on the enslaved person's labor, and yet they reaped no benefits nor have their offspring. According to Sean Rochester's Black Tax, the net worth of the 45 million blacks today is $1.5 trillion. The value of 4 million slaves in 1860 was $22 trillion. Through the New Deals, the government provided $120 billion of subsidies to homeowners, and less than 2% went to black Americans. Simply put, black Americans were left out of the labor force, the business sector, and the housing market.
So where are we now? The black community has $1.5 trillion less in revenue than we otherwise should relative to our portion of the population. $1 trillion of that is associated with business income, 520 billion associated with personal income, right? We talked about the missing net worth. We talked about the 6 million jobs and 1.4 million businesses with employees that are missing. Get a sense of how it's been difficult to invest in those things. And we're trapped in this thing that I call like a 2% economic framework. Now, when I was doing research for the book, this number 2% kept coming up again and again and again and again. And it turned out that in areas really critical to wealth accumulation, we seem to be hovering around 2% representation. So less than 2% of corporate supply chain spend is spent on Black enterprise. Less than 2% of government supply chain spend is spent on Black enterprise. Less than 2% of African American spend, right? So we do a horrible job of spending money on our own businesses. And then when you think about really high growth, high paying occupations, whether it's in the tech sector or it's in Silicon Valley or it's, management at the, in the financial industry, so on and so forth, our representation tends to be around 2%. Thinking about STEM careers, tends to be around, 2%. Black doctors, 2% of Black male, so on and so forth.
Wealth is the most significant dimension of economic well-being. It provides security, stability, greater access to better education, and provides children with a debt-free start. Parental wealth is a key factor that determines personal or family wealth for the next generation. You could say that throughout history, white Americans have benefited from intergenerational transfers as the source of wealth. And yes, different factors contribute to wealth. However, adequate wage, business opportunities, investments, real estate, and home ownership are all drivers of it, and extremely important factors when discussing wealth in America. Well guys, that concludes our 3-part series on the making of America. Thank you so much for tuning in. We hope that you enjoyed it. Be sure to follow us on our social media platforms, and until next time, take care.